Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I call this meeting of the NCUA Board to order. I want to note for the record that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's meeting is open to the public through a live webcast only. The public may access the meeting by visiting the agency's homepage at www.ncua.gov and clicking on the provided webcast link. Presenters in today's webcast meeting are also participating remotely. So if we experience any technical difficulties, I ask for your patience. If you would like to view the closed captioning of this meeting, please click on the CC icon located in the lower left-hand corner of the WebEx window. You may also change the layout to one of your choosing by clicking on the layout option in the top right side of your screen. Our recommended viewing option for this meeting is the stack view. Before we begin with our agenda, and after consulting with the other board offices and our security team, I am pleased to announce that, barring any changes to the COVID-19 pandemic response, our hope is to resume in-person NCUA board meetings beginning with our September meeting. 30 months has been a very long time not to meet in person, and I know that the vice chairman in particular will be pleased to attend his first in-person meeting since joining the NCUA board. More information about the transition from virtual to in-person meetings will be made available closer to the September date. Now, turning to our agenda, the first item of business today is a board briefing on the 2022 NCUA mid-session budget. Eugene Sheed, the Chief Financial Officer, will present. Good morning, Eugene. You may begin when you are ready.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hoffman, and Board Member Hood. I am Eugene Sheed, the NCUA's Chief Financial Officer, before you this morning to present the 2022 mid-session budget review of the NCUA's operating budget, capital budget, and share insurance fund administrative budget. Slide 2, please. On slide 2, I have summarized the key points up front, the takeaways from the 2022 mid-session budget review. Before I jump into some of these points, a bit about the review that we conduct. Staff from my office work with various NCUA offices to understand their spending to date and their planned spending through the rest of the year and how that compares to the board-approved budget. We also look at critical cost categories across offices, such as pay and benefits and travel. Based on this review, we notify NCUA leadership whether board action to adjust the approved budgets is necessary to carry out the operational plans for the current year. The takeaways from the 2022 mid-session budget review are these. We project an operating budget surplus for 2022 of about $18 million. The SIF administrative budget to have a small surplus of about $600,000. The capital budget is 65% obligated through May, with no reported or anticipated surpluses or shortages this year. And at this time, no board action to adjust the approved budgets is necessary. These, of course, are point-in-time estimates. Several factors could influence these estimates up or down as we proceed through the remainder of the year. I will now start to work through in more detail the status of each of the board-approved budgets. Each of these budgets has 2 slides in this presentation, a budget status table, and an accompanying narrative. Slide 3. Slide 3 provides a table, which is an overview of the 3 board-approved budgets. The upper portion of this table depicts the operating fund budget, shown by the cost categories listed in the left-hand column. The subsequent columns, working across the chart from left to right, are the approved budget, the spending status through May upon which our analysis was conducted, and the right-hand columns are the projected surplus in dollars and as a percentage of the budget. The next slide provides additional context for the operating budget surplus. Slide 4. Slide 4 identifies the factors creating the projected $18 million surplus. It is comprised in roughly equal parts of surplus in the pay and benefits category and in the travel category. Pay and benefits is projected to be below budget because of lower aggregate staffing levels through mid-year. Through the end of May, the accounting period upon which the mid-session was conducted, the agency experienced a higher actual vacancy rate than was estimated when we developed the 2022 payroll projections. At present, the agency has 32 hires projected to start in the coming months, and the hiring process to fill vacant positions is ongoing. No change in the board-approved staffing levels are recommended at this time. Travel expenses are lower than budgeted. The agency continues to operate in a largely off-site or remote work posture. Travel has started to increase somewhat, but it remains well below historic averages, as well as below the level budgeted for 2022. The forecast is for travel activity to gradually increase in the fall and through the end of the year, but not to be back to historic patterns. Also impacting the travel budget are inflationary increases in transportation and lodging. Travel spending for 2022 will probably be about 50% or more below the approved budget, meaning a surplus of $9.3 million or greater in the travel category. For the remaining operating budget expense categories, rent, communications, utilities, administrative expenses, and contract services, no material surpluses are projected at this time. Slide 5. Slide 5 and 6 provide the status of the capital budget. Slide 5 lists each of the capital budget projects approved by the board over the past 2 years down the left-hand column of this table. The financial data on this table shows the amounts approved by the board for each project over the past 2 years, the amount of the 2022 budget obligated through May, with the remaining unobligated balance in the right-hand column. Slide 6. This slide provides some context around the capital budget status for 2022. Of the $13.1 million approved in the 2022 budget for capital projects, 65% or $8.5 million was obligated as of May. Capital project funding is generally obligated as contracts supporting the projects are awarded, which can happen throughout the year. Most of the remaining capital project funding should be awarded this year. Unlike the operating fund budget, capital project funds remain available for the project which the board approved and can spend out over multiple years as needed. Slide 7. The table on slide 7 summarizes the status of the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget. This budget funds direct costs associated with certain authorized Share Insurance Fund activities. These direct costs are exclusive of any costs that are shared with the operating fund through the overhead transfer rate and include specific funds for supporting the wind down of the NGN program. Slide 8. As noted on slide 8, this budget covers certain discrete expenses directly attributable to the NCUA's insurance function. In addition to the NGN program, this also includes certain costs for data analytics, financial statement audit, and state examiner travel to certain training programs. Consistent with what I discussed about the operating fund budget, the budget surplus of about $600,000 in the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget is projected the result of lower payroll costs and travel expenses. Slide 9. In conclusion, all three budgets are projected to remain within the levels approved for 2022 by the board, with a projected surplus of about $18 million in the operating fund budget and a $600,000 surplus in the SIF administrative budget. No board action to modify the budget is necessary at this time. Staff will factor in the projected surplus as part of the development of the 2023 budget and operating fee recommendations. Slide 10. My contact information is shown on slide 10, as well as the link to where budget information can be found on the NCUA's website. At this time, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Eugene, for your mid-session briefing on the 2022 budget. As always, I appreciate your team's efforts in preparing these presentations and your careful attention to budgetary matters. The NCUA is on solid budgetary ground. with a projected year-end surplus of around $18 million and a small surplus in the Share Insurance Fund administration budget. A surplus is both a reflection of sound and prudent financial management and an opportunity to ask ourselves whether we can use these financial resources to address important short-term and long-term needs, as well as whether we can prudently return part of this surplus to credit unions. When it comes to our budget, we will not splurge. As a steward of the credit union system, the NCUA board has a responsibility to wisely spend, save, invest, and refund these extra dollars. Credit union members are counting on us to exercise financial restraint. Fiscal restraint on our part should translate into savings for credit union members in the form of higher interest on share deposits, lower interest on their mortgages and other loans, and lower fees, among other benefits. These are all high priority items for family budgets. In focusing on credit union members, we must safeguard both consumer financial protection and safety and soundness. We must also ensure that the NCUA is sufficiently funded to meet our obligations to the taxpayers who back the Share Insurance Fund. Additionally, the NCUA board must ensure the credit union system and the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund can adapt to an evolving financial, economic, and market conditions brought on by various external events and pressures. As such, the agency will continue to prioritize and fund efforts related to cybersecurity, consumer financial protection, equitable financial innovation, and support for small credit unions and minority depository institutions. The existing 2022 budget and staffing levels support these priorities and make necessary investments and commitments to realize our vision for the agency. Eugene, I do have a few questions for you. First, what are the main costs impacting our budget, and what are our options for the prudent management of the budget surplus?
Okay, let's take a look at slide 3 if we could.
Okay.
So the three main cost impacts that drive our budget are payroll, contract services, and travel. Through the payroll costs, or although the payroll costs are lower than budgeted, as I mentioned, the projected payroll for 2022 is still larger than it is in 2021. That is, the pay and benefits costs continue to go up, and they're 75% of our operating budget. So they continue to be one of the main drivers. The largest expense area outside of payroll is contracted services. And within contracted services, by far the largest share of the costs go to technology and information systems, including our cybersecurity efforts. And then the final kind of key cost driver for us, although it's been down substantially since COVID onset, is our travel expenses. That would be the third biggest category. And while we clearly overstated or overestimated how much that was going to be for 2022, it remains a significant part of our operating expenses. As for your question about the prudent management of the $18 million surplus, I think we continue to be cost conscious and to watch spending for the remainder of the year. In recent years, the board has generally opted to hold on to most or all the surplus that gets discussed at the mid-session, and then to apply that or look for ways to use that to buy down essentially future year expenses, which helps to limit future budget growth as well as growth in the operating fee. The presentation I made today does not include any recommendations that would increase future budget expenses. That concludes my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. That is helpful information to have to give us a full picture of the budgetary landscape. And Eugene, looking ahead to next year, with travel returning to a more normal state and general inflationary pressures, what can we expect for the direction of the 2023 budget? Could you please lay out some changes that we can expect on line items, both up and down, and what items will have to be considered as part of the budget next year?
Sure. So I think we'll continue to see upward budget pressures going forward. Staff turnover and vacancies, as I noted, have created some of the near-term surplus in pay and benefits as compared to the budget. But as those positions get filled, the payroll expenses will continue to grow. I think the second area you're going to see some, would expect to see some increase in is going to be travel. Travel's been sharply curtailed during the pandemic. We estimated obviously too much travel for the 2022 budget, but again, anticipating we have seen it start to travel start to increase, and I think that will continue. While I don't expect we'll see pre-COVID pandemic travel patterns, as I noted, inflationary pressures are particularly hitting the travel expenses, particularly airfare and lodging. And we continue to be more reliant on technology and have an ongoing need for better information and data as a part of our mission in protecting the Share Insurance Fund. So I think we'll continue to see pressures in the contracted services, particularly as it relates to technology expenses. That concludes my response.
Thanks, Eugene. I certainly appreciate the observations about travel. I know that last year's proposed budget was higher than we ultimately approved. And for the last couple of years, we've overestimated travel, and we may find ourselves in a place next year that we might underestimate travel. So I do think we need to be careful. I also appreciate all the transparency you provided about what may happen with next year's budget. And I look forward to seeing a staff draft budget soon so that the NCUA board can obtain public input, deliberate, and again, reach consensus on future spending. In closing, I thank my fellow board members and the NCUA team for remaining fiscally responsible and for working together to operate within our means while achieving our core goals of allowing credit unions to meet the credit and savings needs of their members, including those of modest means, with safe, fair, and affordable financial products and services. We can never lose sight of the fact that our efforts to protect the hard-earned savings of credit union members helps them to achieve financial security. That concludes my remarks. Vice Chairman Hoffman, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations again, Todd, on your swearing in last week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene and team, for the presentation. Last year, we voted on the mid-session budget in September. I'm sure the credit union community welcomes the timeliness of this year's review and the fact you're working on delivering the 2023 budget earlier as well. Transparency in government is one of my guiding principles. It goes hand in hand with regulatory clarity and timeliness. Agencies like NCUA are quirky in that the agency just says a dollar amount and then the credit unions pay it. That's obviously unlike any other transaction we do in life. Even politicians that set tax rates know they will soon face the voters' opinion. A business that charges too much will lose customers. But our situation is indeed somewhat quirky at NCUA. It's a rather different type of transaction. So I'd like to propose that the budget hearing we have later this year be a true dialogue between NCUA and those who pay us. The hearing should have an actual give and take, so to speak, between NCUA and credit unions to arrive at a common understanding. This type of hearing seems fair, and it's yet another way NCUA can be a model of good government. Although we are not voting on it today, I wish to comment on the projected surplus of $18 million. It's not a surprise that the $18 million is concentrated in two areas, pay and travel. A surplus is a good thing, much preferred to the alternative. Yet this $18 million surplus is credit union money for the simple reason that all of NCUA's budget is credit union money. My questions today will focus on how credit unions themselves benefit from this surplus. I'm hopeful that once we get back to normal, or more accurately, the new normal, NCUA, just like the rest of the world, can continue to take advantage of the lessons we learned regarding virtual exams, as well as communications, meetings, and more. The cost savings and efficiencies could have a significant impact on future budgets. We certainly deserve some positives from the forced experiments caused by the pandemic. I do have a couple of questions for you, Eugene. So last year we had a significant surplus, and some of it was returned to the credit unions. How does this projected surplus differ? And is there an opportunity for the surplus cash to be sent directly back to the credit unions?
Thank you for that question, Vice Chairman. The action on the 2022 budget included both an offset that was attributable to the surplus or the unused portion of the 2021 budget, and that was $23 million. It also, last year, the actions included an analysis of the operating fund's cash position, which resulted in an offset to the operating fee calculation. So there were sort of two different actions there. Both of these are being considered by staff again as part of the 2023 budget proposal. The $18 million that I mentioned in my presentation this morning is a bit lower than the 2020, or the 23 million that offset the 22 plan, but we'll continue to refine that estimate as we put the budget together. Thank you.
Okay. So should a credit union out there listening to this expect a check of some sorts back to them? No, correct?
So not actually in the form of a check. What we did last year was to lower because they still had an operating fee to pay.
Sure.
We covered specifically that amount, and I anticipate that we will be able to do that again in 2023.
Gotcha. All right. Either way, it's still a cash flow improvement for the credit union, straight up. Okay. Eugene, as you know, last year my office spent a fraction of its travel budget. I didn't get to keep any of that money for this year, correct?
You are correct. The funds approved as a part of the annual operating fund budget are generally only available for use by an office during the budget year, unless the board approves otherwise. Offices don't otherwise get to keep their unused money from a prior year.
Yeah. Obviously, my point is not about my travel budget. It's about the way the agency should deal with it the same way. And remind us, when do we expect to see the first draft of the 2023 budget?
The planned timeline for public release of the 2023 budget is the end of September 2022. So about 2 months.
All right, perfect. And last thing. So Eugene, are you on board for maybe a different kind of budget hearing this year? One that occurs well before the final budget, one that involves a good faith back and forth with stakeholders, and one that might result in actual changes to the budget itself?
Yes, I am. So I believe that's the intent of the budget process, what you described, to give notice of the budget, to get that thoughtful, constructive feedback, and then to consider any changes that should be made to the draft proposal.
And I appreciate your thoughtful response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. And, when I worked on Capitol Hill for Congressman Konjorsky, he was a big fan of having a roundtable format versus a hearing format. I've always found it more informative, and certainly you have my commitment to work together with your office to figure out how we can best do that in the context of this budget. I think we can do just that. So thank you. Board Member Hood, you are now recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Eugene, thank you so much for your updated mid-session budget presentation this morning. But before I begin, I too want to congratulate Chairman Harper on his recent swearing in for a new term. Chairman Harper is indeed the first NCUA board member to be reappointed to a full 6-year term, as I understand it, at least in modern times. So I know that we as an agency are going to greatly benefit from Chairman Harper's new term because of his significant agency experience, both as a board member, chairman, and as a former NCUA staffer. I must also say that I'm delighted Chairman Harper's recent reappointment opens doors to the past, present, and future NCUA board members who have not had a full 6-year term. Having served 2 stints on the NCUA board personally, I must say that having previous agency experience benefits not only credit, but also the entire credit union industry and NCUA. Now, moving on to this year's mid-year budget, I do once again, as the other board members have stated, I think it's great news as we look at today's mid-session budget that we're seeing a residual budget balance, or frankly better known as a surplus. And as I said last year, as we look at this surplus, I want everyone to know that staff is drafting the 2023 budget right now as we speak. I'd certainly like to see staff develop a budget that controls costs and gives funds back to credit unions in some form or fashion. And Eugene, I know that based on the mid-year financials, the board will in fact have an option to return funds back to credit unions. And I know this is something that the vice chairman has just discussed as well, similar to returning funds as we did last year. And as you all know, I push for this quite heavily. At the mid-year point, what options do we expect the board to have when we consider the 2023 budget? I know you've talked about this at length, but would just like for just a quick summary, Eugene. Especially as we think about getting to a new normal operating environment post-COVID and what impact that would likely have on the budget, other than travel and staffing, perhaps.
So I think some of the options looking forward, apart from travel and staffing, are going to be the other area is going to be the contracted services. So continuing it, part of our budget development process, we carefully consider contracts and the need for them, and scrutinize which need to be continued and where we may need to see adjustments upwards. So that, in addition to what you mentioned, sir, would be the third area that I'd point out.
Great. Thank you, Eugene. And then just finally, as I prepare to close shortly, yesterday, the NCUA received a letter from NAFCU. And in the letter, Dan Berger, its president and CEO, said, and I quote, "With the reduction in this year's operating fee, the cash balances in the operating fund have begun to plateau after a notable rise from 2016 through 2021. However, NAFCU notes that the cash balance has still doubled in that same time span, even after scaling to the size of the overall operating budget. NAFCU once more calls on the NCUA to scrutinize its cash needs to determine whether these funds are truly necessary, and if so, why the agency's cash needs have risen so dramatically in such a short period of time." End of quote. Eugene, why do we have such a large cash balance? Again, if we can get back to just answering some of those questions from NAFCU. And I would just note for all of those joining us today, we will have an opportunity to address a lot of these issues and concerns when we do our public budget hearing later this year. Was delighted that the vice chairman raised the issue of us giving the industry more time to digest the budget, to really give us their views and feedback, and that there can be an open dialogue regarding it. But again, I want the folks to know we take letters seriously and comments. And again, we're one of the few agencies that will do a public briefing. So the folks from NAFCU, thank you for your comment letter, but you will have additional opportunities to address this topic later. But again, Eugene, if you can just go to some of the issues raised by the NAFCU letter on yesterday.
Sure. So I review the cash position of the operating fund monthly. And the vast majority of the funds, the cash that we have, is allotted through our budget process and budget management system for the uses approved by the board. In other words, I need to make sure that the agency has the cash available to pay the bills for the items that the board has approved in its budget. So that comprises the vast majority of the cash. We do take a look, as I say, at all the categories. We also have reserve, which we talked about during the budget process last year, for certain unbudgeted future liabilities. And we assess the extent to which those may become, we need to hold on to cash to possibly pay those expenses in the future. So we do this similar analysis of the fund's position that we did for 2022. I think we'll do that, or we will do that as a part of the 2023 budget process to review both the cash balances as well as the potential liabilities for unbudgeted items and present that analysis as part of the 2023 budget. Ultimately, it's a board decision, but I anticipate that we'll have surplus cash that could be credited back to federally chartered credit unions as part of the operating fee calculation like we did for 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene, for that very detailed response. And I'm going to close by just again reiterating, we do take public feedback very seriously. We enjoy having the dialogue with our entities, whether it be the trade groups or the credit unions themselves. I just returned recently from the World Council of Credit Unions annual conference, where we were able to join with thousands of individual credit unions who were all sharing their insights and views about what they can do to keep the system of cooperative credit alive throughout the world. I want you all to know that NCUA is considered a beacon of light and quite informative as it comes to the work that we're doing here to keep our 131 million members of credit unions accounts safe, and the work that we've done to foster greater financial inclusion and access. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that as I meet with the credit unions from all over the world, whether it's the SACCOs in Africa, the Cooperativas in Central and South America, or the building societies there in the United Kingdom, they all look to our model as one that's worthy of being replicated throughout many regions. One of the things I would be remiss that if I didn't tell you that stands out is our transparency as a board and our transparency as a regulatory entity. People love the fact that we give you an opportunity to opine on our rulemakings, an ability to opine also on our budget. So please know you all, we are really well regarded, and I'm happy to be a part of a system here at the United States that really propels our 5,000 nearly credit unions to serve their members. Thank you. That concludes my time.
Thank you so much, Board Member Hood. I also appreciate your very kind words at the start and share your views that agency knowledge is very important for a board member to have. I also look forward, consistent, of course, with our rules and procedures in the Sunshine Act, debriefing to learn more about what you learned during your visit with the World Council of Credit Unions. It's important that we attend that event. That concludes our consideration of the first agenda item. The second item on our agenda today is final rule, parts 700, 701, 708A, 708B, 750, and 790, asset and supervision threshold for determining the appropriate supervisory office. Staff presenting includes Scott Hunt, Director, Office of National Examinations and Supervision, and Rachel Ackman, Senior Staff Attorney, Office of General Counsel. Scott and Rachel, you may begin when you are ready.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hopman, and Board Member Hood. I'm here to recommend approval of a final rule that will effectively change the board policy defining when a large consumer credit union transfers to the supervision of the Office of National Examinations and Supervision, or ONES. In brief, I'm proposing a new threshold be set at $15 billion in assets. The proposal was issued for comment and we received 5 responses. After considering these comments, which were largely favorable, staff recommends no substantive changes be made to the proposal. The impetus for change in threshold is to balance the resource demands of the ONES supervision program with the potential risk a large credit union poses to the share insurance fund. When ONES was launched in 2014, 4 credit unions had assets of $10 billion or more, and the insurance fund balance was about $12 billion. Today, ONES supervises 11 large consumer credit unions, and the insurance fund stands at about $21 billion. However, there are 8 more credit unions that would transition to ONES effective January 23 under the current rules. This substantive growth would require a significant investment in field personnel by ONES. If the proposal is approved by the board, it is projected only 1 credit union would transition to ONES over the next 2 years based on growth trends. Thus, this change will slow the pace of growth of the ONES portfolio. I will also highlight what will not change under the proposal. Any credit union currently supervised by ONES will remain with ONES. The proposal's grandfather clause has been removed as it is now unnecessary. All credit unions currently supervised by ONES exceeded $15 billion in assets as of March 31, 2022. March 31 will remain the measurement date to determine applicability of the threshold, and the following January will be the effective date for transition into ONES. We believe retaining these dates best provides for ease of planning any potential transitions, both for credit unions and the agency. The capital planning and stress testing requirements will remain, with the tiering system also maintaining the current thresholds. ONES is working with the regions to transition responsibility for capital plan reviews for Tier 1 credit unions. All credit unions $10 billion or more will submit investment share and loan data to NCUA as is current practice. This requirement enables NCUA to implement and oversee capital planning and stress testing rule while also enhancing its supervisory efforts. ONES will remain the primary point of contact for data collection and will continue its current practice to onboard new credit unions to this requirement prior to their transition date. ONES will share report analysis with the regions and their counterparts in the SSAs to support supervision responsibilities. Credit unions are reminded ONES posts information pertinent to large credit unions on the agency website under regulatory and compliance resources. This includes links to the regulations, guidance, capital planning summary reviews, and the share and loan data template. We encourage credit unions to reference this information to inform them of supervisory and regulatory expectations. Staff proposes the rule be effective January 1, 2023. This concludes my remarks. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Scott, for providing that overview to the NCUA board on the final rule to adjust the asset threshold for assigning supervision of covered credit consumer credit unions to the Office of National Examinations and Supervision, or otherwise known as ONES, of course. Your teams, both in your office as well as Rachel and her team in the Office of General Counsel, did an excellent job of working together to finalize the rule that the board will vote on today. This rule, as I look at it, is a natural evolution of the NCUA's examination program as the number of large, complex consumer credit unions continues to grow. Additionally, this final rule continues to provide the appropriate oversight for those systemically critical credit unions, which pose a greater risk to the share insurance fund given their size and their complexity. By adjusting the asset threshold for determining which covered credit unions fall under one supervision, the NCUA can leverage the strengths of its regional structure to ensure the agency can effectively and efficiently monitor potential risks associated with these institutions within existing resource allocations and current organizational structures. With the rapid balance sheet growth across the credit union system since the start of the pandemic, especially for our largest of credit unions, recalibrating the threshold was always a question of when, not if. In fact, federally insured credit unions with just under $10 billion in total assets experienced balance sheet growth of about 14% on average during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and more than 34% in one case. This asset growth represented a marked increase from the average increase of just 9% for this same group of credit unions in 2019. Without today's action, the number of covered credit unions supervised by ones would nearly double in 2023. Such growth would have required a substantial reallocation of personnel within the agency and thereby incurred an undue and avoidable cost burden. So with the adoption of this rule, we are minimizing budget expenditures and reducing organizational disruptions. That is good for the agency, good for staff, good for large credit unions, good for credit union members, and good for the taxpayers who back the Share Insurance Fund. This change has other benefits, such as creating new development opportunities for examiners, providing a smoother transition for consumer credit unions that will eventually transfer to one supervision, and enhancing knowledge sharing and expertise between ones and regional staff. That collaboration extends to training regional staff on their new supervisory responsibilities related to capital planning and stress testing. What is more, approval of this final rule is a significant acknowledgement of the industry's ongoing maturation and the evolving role the NCUA plays in supervising and insuring our nation's largest credit unions. Looking ahead, the NCUA will revisit this rule at a future time as consumer credit unions continue to increase in size and complexity, and as we refine our assessments of risks to the Share Insurance Fund. Mindful of these long-term trends, we should also consider the development of a regional large credit union program for larger credit unions to further stabilize one's workload demands and better address the unique needs of this important segment of the industry. And this idea was suggested by staff last year. If implemented, the NCUA would essentially, as I understand it, Scott, have 4 exam processes. First, we would have a streamlined system for well-run small credit unions. Then we would have a risk-focused exam program for small credit unions experiencing difficulties, as well as for all credit unions that are slightly bigger in size above that threshold. We would also then create, so that's the second one. Then we would, for a third one, have a specialized regional program for even larger credit unions, those nearing or crossing the $10 billion threshold until they get up to $15 billion. And finally, we would have one supervision for the largest credit unions above $15 million in assets. Scott, could you give us or add some additional ideas about how a regional large credit union program might work, understanding that these are your thoughts and your thoughts alone, and that we would need to bring the regional directors in to weigh in on this? And what is the timeline, do you know, for further refining this idea that staff made for future board action?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. And I do appreciate you stating that this would be a cross-functional team that would have to prepare the ideas of I'll call it a regional large credit union program.
Yeah.
Certainly would be seeking RD and E&I comments. I think where we would generally seek is standardizing expectations and exam processes for these larger credit unions to create some consistency how we look at risk and view ratings assessments across the regions. I think this may include honing in on risk management governance and testing capital resiliency. But I also recognize that the standards need not be as robust as one's. So I look forward to the collaboration. To be clear, we have not started on this endeavor. We look forward to board guidance in this area, but we could certainly begin as soon as that guidance is provided.
I appreciate that. As you know, I'm a servant leader, and I like to hear the ideas that staff have because you're the ones closer to the field and the action and the credit unions themselves. But certainly, it is a conversation between both the board and staff along the way. I have to say, though, the concept of creating a regional large credit union program makes sense, and I look forward to learning more as we continue these conversations. Scott, my next question concerns risk management. In finalizing the rule, the board has reconsidered the level of risk to the share insurance fund posed by a credit union with between $10 billion and $15 billion in assets. Would you explain in more detail how the risk profile of a credit union with $15 billion or more in assets today compares to one with $10 billion or more of assets in 2013 when ones first began operations?
Sure. The essence of ones is the board's desire to increase oversight for those credit unions that pose a systemic risk to the share insurance fund, as I think prior remarks. At the time of one's inception, the share insurance fund's balance was about $11 billion, and today it stands closer to $21 billion. Thereby, this has informed why we made the recommendation that we could move the threshold for one supervision from 10 billion to 15 because of the near doubling in size of the share insurance fund to protect against losses.
Is that, do you have anything to add?
My remarks.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. Finally, Scott, would you outline for and how the NCUA consulted with regional office and state regulators in developing this rule? I should say your office as well as GC. And going forward, how will ones coordinate with regional offices and state regulators in the areas of capital planning and stress testing?
Sure. When we were exploring whether to adjust the threshold, there was a team from ones, E&I, and across the regions to develop a white paper to sort of sort through some ideas and provide some proposals and possibilities. It formed the foundation for the rule. We've also had conversations with the SSAs through NASCUS and on the proposal. We've considered all the formal comments, and some of these were also proposed by NASCUS in terms of addressing the state supervisory input to the rule. Lastly, I'll say NCUA has and will continue to share the results of capital planning and stress test results with the appropriate SSAs as well as the regions, should this proposal be approved by the board. That concludes my remarks, sir.
Thank you, Scott. I will certainly support this final rule on modifying asset thresholds for one's supervision. In closing, Scott, thank you, and Rachel, thank you as well, although I didn't have any questions for you. I also want to thank the entire one's team, including Lynn Markgraf, Travis Vaughn, and Dale Klein, as well as Ian Morena and Frank Cressman in the Office of General Counsel for your collaboration in shepherding this rule to completion. That concludes my remarks. Vice Chairman Hauptman.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Scott and Rachel, for putting together the presentation. Earlier this board meeting, we discussed the budget, and this item is good news for that budget. Without this threshold change, the ones team, those who examine the larger credit unions, have projected the need for up to 14 new staff because of the number of credit unions crossing the 10 billion threshold and therefore moving to one supervision. Adjusting this threshold keeps supervision for credit unions crossing the 10 billion threshold with their designated regional NCUA office until they hit 15 billion in assets. However, credit unions that move into the $10 billion category over that must still comply with capital planning requirements that come with that threshold. The only thing we are changing is who is responsible for supervision. This was not intended as regulatory relief, although I understand the desire to ask for relief for regulatory burden at every opportunity. Without this change, it is safe to say new staff and ones will be needed in the immediate future. I want to emphasize this is a money-saving decision by NCUA. I want to mention that I understand why some people initially thought today's change was about something different. They heard the words NCUA changing thresholds from 10 billion to 15 billion and initially got excited in the belief that today's action had something to do with regulatory relief. And while my view is well known that some regulation benefits the regulators more than the regulated, today's vote was never intended to be anything more than a money-saving internal change to NCUA's operations. This change is just a stopgap, however. As credit unions grow in assets, more supervision will eventually move to ones. And today we're at an appropriate point to thoughtfully evaluate our supervision strategy. I'd like to ask my fellow board members to commit resources for review of asset thresholds and what they mean next year, not just adjusting the thresholds themselves, but other tools as well. For example, one elegant way that agencies give regulatory relief is via the regulated entities earning, for example, a less frequent exam cycle or other positive things through stellar exam results and high capital levels. This sort of regulatory relief aligns incentives for all parties. NCUA can focus on the credit unions that need help. The credit unions that earned regulatory relief really want to keep that status via continued excellent performance. The successful supervision of credit unions as unique member-owned cooperatives always brings its own challenges. So a review of asset thresholds would help us be more deliberate in our strategy. That said, I commend staff for coming up with today's change that saves money and ensures more supervision occurs at the regional level. That concludes my remarks. I just have the one question. Can you just review the changes? If a credit union sitting today at, say, 9.9 billion and may soon go over that threshold, what changes happen in their life now if we pass this?
Yes, sir. So under that scenario, so let's say they're $9.9 billion today. So we're sitting in July. We would look to the next measurement date, which would be March 31 of 2023, to determine if that credit union crossed $10 billion. If so, then effective January 1, 2024, they would transition to be a $10 billion credit union subject to capital planning, but they would remain under regional supervision up until the time they cross $15 billion on a March 31 effective date. So in essence, their supervision would continue to remain with the regions for foreseeable years, but capital planning would be introduced in this scenario as early as January 1, 2024. That's my answer.
Thank you, sir. So somebody sitting at 9.9 still pretty much has the same cost benefit in their head. Do I want to cross 10 billion or not? Still the same as it was, without this rule. The only difference is you're going to keep your regional supervision. And if for some reason you don't want your regional supervision, then you should merge with a $5 billion credit union and you'll get rid of your regional supervision and you go to ones. All right. I got it. Appreciate everything you guys did on this. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you so much. Board Member Hood, you may begin.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too would like to thank Scott Hunt and Rachel Ackman, and especially all the ones team for all the hard work that goes into not just getting this rulemaking before us today, but for the work they do at all times to keep a really strong and safe credit union system. My views on this topic have evolved since this rule first came before the board in February as a proposed rule. My views have evolved in part because of comment letters we received, in addition to other external engagement that I've had with the industry and other individuals where this issue has become the subject of conversation. So to the public listening today, your comments matter, and they do indeed inform my views. And I would say, my fellow board members, when we hear from you, they do influence our decision-making processes. So again, thank you for that. We're here today because large credit unions experience significant share growth due to the pandemic, outpacing the Office of National Exam Supervision's ability to supervise all natural person credit unions over $10 billion in assets with the current authorized staffing levels. As was mentioned, 14 new additions would be required were it not for today's rulemaking. In reality, the advantage of raising the threshold for credit unions transferring into ones is the ability of the regions to provide insight and supervision to credit unions and to use their incredible depth of talent there in those regions to supervise these larger credit unions. It also gives the regions a vital voice and view into the data program ONES has recently created. The regions, as I've mentioned, have tremendous talent, and they do bring to the table a lot of resources. And I do think raising the threshold will help accomplish this. Scott, do we have your commitment that ONES will bring the regions into the discussion and decision making as to what data to collect and how to present it?
Yes, sir. I do believe this will be a collaborative effort to make this data and information of value for both ones and the large credit unions under the regional supervision. As I did mention, as far as executing the data collection, that will remain with ones. The agency has invested experts as far as the ingest and cleansing of this data, but it certainly will be a collaborative process on making those reports informational and valuable across regions and ones. That concludes my answer, sir.
Great, thank you, Scott. And as a safety and soundness regulator, a regional structure does not have a single point of failure in the supervisory process. As you all would agree, we've seen the risk of having a single point of failure at the NCUA during the recent corporate crisis well over a decade ago. And we've hopefully learned and gleaned a lot of insight from that. I would add that the ONE supervisory program is overseen by E&I for quality control purposes, but I'm not sure this goes far enough to remove the single point of failure concern from the ONES program. So at this point, I think it's appropriate to walk down memory lane. The ONES office was created in 2012 following the creation of the Federal Stability Oversight Council and the Dodd-Frank provisions. So let me ask a question for the record. Has FSOC ever designated a credit union as too big to fail?
No, sir.
Great, thank you. And so while we did not have any systemically important financial institutions at the NCUA that will result in posing a risk to the U.S. financial stability, the NCUA board did in 2012 decide that we needed to follow suit and create a ONES office as they believed the nation's largest credit unions were systemically important to the Share Insurance Fund. I want to be clear, there are indeed some advantages to having a ONES office. For one, there's a consistent treatment and supervision regime over all of our large credit unions. The office allowed for the agency to adopt supervisory standards specific to larger credit unions. Since inception, we've adopted capital planning and stress test regulations to instill supervisory expectations that credit unions plan for future risk and assess capital beyond the current PCA standards. We've also created a continuous monitoring process, and we have prioritized the concept of governance as critically important. For context, the OCC and the FDIC have large bank programs apart from supervision of smaller banks. But the way ONES office is structured does have a few disadvantages, including that the program lies specifically in one office. Perhaps better stated, there is a single point of failure risk, notwithstanding the E&I's role in the process, as previously mentioned. So at this point, I do have a few more questions. Another issue is the significant increase in supervision hours one gets compared to the other regions. So Scott, how can the board have more accountability, monitoring, and reporting of hours during this process?
I'll say specifically to resources necessary to conduct the supervision. We do provide this information to E&I and they formally comment. So again, that is part of the quality assurance process built into their oversight. As you are also aware, on a quarterly basis, E&I submits summary reports of their QA and quality control processes to the board so that the board has visibility on their oversight of ONES supervision. That concludes my remarks, sir.
Great, thank you, Scott. And I do think prudent leadership in this regard is quite important. Is there more risk at all for that $10 million credit union relative to a smaller credit union?
I'd say the way I look at this question is the relative systemic risk should a credit union fail. Not implying that a larger or smaller credit union has inherently more risk of a potential loss, but should a larger credit union, 10 billion in your question, fail, yes, it would have a deeper impact to the health of the Share Insurance Fund. That concludes my answer, sir.
So would you agree then that while more dollars may be at risk at a large credit union, it's not significantly higher? And what I'm trying to get at is, since the creation of the fund, smaller credit unions are at higher risk of causing the NCUS losses. Has that been the case?
I can't specifically answer that question. I think we can follow up if I consult with E&I after this meeting. It's my general understanding the number of losses may be concentrated in smaller institutions, but for certain there are larger institutions that have cost the share insurance fund more and deeper losses.
Okay, well, thank you. But then when the one's office was created, a $10 billion insurance payout I recognize would nearly have depleted the fund. Would that be correct? And how does that relate to today?
So as I understand the question, a $10 billion loss, yes, back in 2012 or 2013 would nearly deplete the entire fund because the balance of the fund at that time was around 11 billion. Under my prior remarks, today's fund stands at $21 billion. So yes, there's more loss absorption capacity, although we also must be mindful of the capitalization deposit and the structure of the fund, thereby if we would erode the retained earnings of the share insurance fund, it could trigger premiums to be paid by the credit unions, even if there was a balance within the share insurance fund. That concludes my answer, sir.
Great, thank you, Scott. And again, looking at those larger credit unions, let's say over 500 million, are they all performing better today and financially compared to when we were looking at this issue a while ago? And also especially looking at smaller credit unions?
To the first part of the question, I can't answer the question if they are operating better today than back in 2012, if that's what I understand your question
Yes,
to be.
sir. I'm just trying to get a feel for performance then and now.
I will generally say that over the recent years, the largest credit unions have proven very resilient, especially through the pandemic, to retain healthy capital ratios, to build programs that service their members through times of need. As we know, the pandemic challenged many consumers needing some relief on lending and providing that service credit unions do. And I think the large credit unions did a strong job in meeting those demands without sacrificing the financial health of their institutions. I can't compare and contrast the one's credit union performance to other credit unions. Again, I would suggest I can get back to you with a more formal answer if I consult with E&I.
Great, thank you, Scott. But again, would you say then that safety and soundness is, quite frankly, safety and soundness regardless of asset size?
I think it's prudent for NCUA to develop supervisory and regulatory expectations based on the size, risk, and complexity of the institution. That concludes my answer.
Great. Well, thank you all for indulging me, Scott. Also, it's worth pointing out, though, that we now have a risk-based capital regime in effect. I know that our chairman and others have said that RBC is supposed to identify complex credit unions, that is, large credit unions with over $500 million in assets with an unacceptable level of risk as determined by the ratio. Since we now have a monitoring tool in place with RBC, despite its flaws that some have mentioned, you could easily make the case we should be using these lower ratios to focus our exam teams and thus should restructure our examinations. We can use lower RBC ratios to focus on risk and not size. So while RBC and net worth are lagging indicators, how does RBC impact the needs for the one's office?
I would say the risk-based capital level of a one's institution is but one of several measures we look at when establishing the financial health of the institution. Would you like me to further elaborate?
If you don't mind, please.
Well, certainly to my prior answer, we look at the complexity of operations, the relative level of capital, and importantly, the exercise of reviewing a credit union's capital plan goes a long way into really understanding the nature of risks and threats specific to that institution. We look at the credit union's book of business. We, as I said, or alluded to earlier with our data collection, we can see the underlying credit quality of its lending program. We can see its concentrations. And then we look through the capital plan through the eyes of the credit union, how it views its risk, how it explores adverse events on the health of its institution, and should it feel uncomfortable or out of its own risk tolerances, the proposed responses by those credit unions to ensure that they remain healthy should those potential adverse conditions arise. And of course, our job is also to have a back office challenge function, which the board has authorized through the development of the ONE's quantitative analysis division, where we have the ability to conduct our own risk analysis and have conversations with the credit unions when there's disparate views. That concludes my answer, sir.
Great. Thank you for that very detailed response, Scott. I must say, though, with the continued consolidation in our industry and with credit unions becoming more and more complex, today's rule does not quite go far enough for the risk we have as an agency if the ONE's office grows too quickly. Additionally, I wish the rule provided additional regulatory relief to credit unions in terms of capital planning. I learned from one credit union with these new requirements, it's going to cost them nearly $1 million a year. Yes, I would have preferred that this rule provide further relief to our capital planning regime, as the state of the share of the insurance fund has changed significantly since the last financial crisis. While I have serious reservations and believe the rule does not go far enough with the continued growth and consolidation in the industry, I plan to support this rule ultimately because it does protect the NCUA regional structure without undermining our ability to regulate the largest credit unions in the ONE's portfolio. I believe it is worth considering having a large regional program to ensure a smooth transition to ONE's for the largest and most systemically important credit unions, and to enhance the quality of supervision for the largest credit unions. And I think it's safe to say that the $15 billion threshold is too low for what is considered a systemically important credit union. I recognize that we can have time to revisit this at a later time. I just have one further question, and that is for the record, and it goes with what the Vice Chairman was asking earlier about that $9.99 billion institution and what happens with them. Scott, for the record, could you mention that it's my understanding for those institutions between 10 and $15 billion today, that in order for them to come into the ONE's structure, it would require an NCUA board vote. Is that correct?
Correct, sir. Under the language within the rule, it's under the section titled Reservation of Authority. The board reserves the right to place a credit union into a higher tier category. That decision rests with the board. There is no delegations below the board level. That concludes my answer, sir.
Great, thank you. And again, I do thank ONE's for the hard work that they all put forth each and every day. And I also applaud our regions. I think they really are those on the ground foot soldiers when it comes to really looking at the needs of their respective regions. So I recognize that this is going to require them to expand their work, but I think they're fully up to the challenge. And I really am excited about the work that they will continue to do every day to instill a safe and sound credit union system. I have no further comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Board Member Hood. You raise a number of important points. And the NCUA's Enterprise Risk Management Council is currently evaluating NCUA's approach to large credit union supervision. In the past, the council has overseen reviews of enterprise risks or certain areas of enterprise risks, and large credit union supervision is currently under evaluation. This evaluation gets to the points that you were making. It's intended to assess if there are gaps in how the NCUA addresses risks, and that the overall supervision of large credit unions addresses from an enterprise level. I do look forward to that analysis. I do look forward to working with you and Vice Chairman Hauptman to make sure that we get this right, because I don't think any of us want to be in a place where we have a $6 billion hole that we need to plug and go to Congress to ask for additional money. Having been in the congressional seat when this was first went through the corporate crisis, it's not a place I want our agency, and I don't think it's a place any of us want to be in. With that, is there a motion? Vice Chairman Hauptman.
Yes, sir. I move that the board approve final rule, part 700, 701, 708A, 708B, 750, and 790 of NCUA's rules and regulations as attached to the board action memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
There is a sufficient second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show that the motion passed 3-0. The third and final item on our agenda today is proposed rule, Part 748, Cyber Incident Notification Requirements. Staff presenting, Yvonne Aploni, Associate Director, Office of Examination and Insurance, Christina Sari, Information Systems Officer, Office of Examination and Insurance, and Ian Morena, Associate General Counsel, Office of General Counsel. Yvonne, Christina, Ian, please begin.
Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hoffman, and Board Member Hood. This is Yvonne Apolloni. We are here to present for the board's approval a notice of proposed rulemaking on cyber incident notification requirements for federally insured credit unions. Before we discuss the specifics of this proposed rule, I'd like to provide some background and context for why we're proposing this rule. The cybersecurity of the nation's federally insured credit unions has been and continues to be a top priority for the NCUA. According to the FBI's 2021 Internet Crime Report, cyber attacks reported to federal law enforcement agencies has increased in frequency and severity in recent years. Additionally, according to the same report, the financial services sector is one of the top U.S. critical infrastructure sectors that is repeatedly targeted by ransomware attacks. Bad actors may also use cyber attacks to deploy and use destructive malware and other malicious software to target weaknesses in computers and networks of federally insured credit unions. Some cyber attacks have the potential to alter, delete, or otherwise render a credit union's data and systems unusable. Depending on the scope of the cyber incident, a credit union's data and system backups may also be affected, which can severely affect the ability of the credit union to recover operations and serve its members. These cyber attacks are typically deployed with malicious intent. In November 2021, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation issued a final rule requiring their banking organizations to report certain computer security incidents to their primary regulator no later than 36 hours after determining a notification incident has occurred. In March of this year, Congress enacted the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. This act requires the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, to publish a final rule by September 2025 that will require covered entities, which will be defined in that rule, to report certain cyber incidents to CISA not later than 72 hours after their occurrence. The financial services sector, which credit unions are part of, is considered a U.S. critical infrastructure sector. In determining whether the NCUA should issue its own cyber incident notification rule, staff considered several factors, including the increased number of incidents, the severity of those incidents, reporting requirements of the other regulatory agencies, whether the information that would be provided under the proposed rule could be attained through existing reporting standards, and what reporting timeframes are reasonable for credit unions. Currently, federally insured credit unions may be required to report certain instances of disruptive cyber events and cyber crimes by filing suspicious activity reports with the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network no later than 30 calendar days after the initial detection. In addition, federally insured credit unions should notify the appropriate NCUA regional director as soon as possible when they become aware of an incident involving unauthorized access to or use of sensitive member information. Federally insured credit unions are also required to notify the NCUA within 5 business days of any catastrophic act that occurs at their office or offices. And a catastrophic act is defined as a disaster, natural or otherwise, resulting in physical destruction or damage to the credit union or causing an interruption in the vital member services. As you can see, these reporting requirements are widely varied. While some of these reporting provisions can provide the NCUA with valuable insight for some cyber-related events and information security compromises, they do not provide the agency with sufficient timely information about every substantial cyber incident that would be captured in this new reporting requirement. Some cyber incidents may be the result of non-malicious failure of hardware or software, personnel errors, and other causes, which could also severely disrupt a credit union's ability to conduct business operations. Given the frequency and severity of cyber incidents within the financial services industry, it is important that the NCUA be notified of cyber incidents that disrupt a federally insured credit union's operations, lead to unauthorized access to sensitive data, or disrupt members' access to accounts or services. Therefore, the NCUA believes this proposed rule is necessary because the current reporting requirements, while they could be related to cyber incidents in some instances, are neither designed nor intended to provide timely information to the NCUA about such incidents. Where appropriate, the proposed rule mirrors the Cyber Incident Reporting Act of 2022. In short, the proposed rule will require a federally insured credit union that experiences a reportable cyber incident to report the incident to the NCUA as soon as possible, but not later than 72 hours after the credit union reasonably believes that it has experienced a reportable cyber incident. This notification would give the NCUA timely information of emerging threats to individually federally insured credit unions and potentially to the broader financial system. Thank you, and I will now turn the presentation over to Christina Sari, who will explain what a cyber incident is and when a cyber incident rises to the level of being a reportable incident. Following Christina, Ian Morenin will briefly highlight the basic information proposed to be reported, how this information will inform the NCUA, and our analysis on the burden and impact of the reporting to credit unions.
Christina, you may be muted.
Thank you, Yvonne. Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hoffman, and Board Member Hood. This is Christina Sari. As Yvonne mentioned, the proposed rule requires a federally insured credit union to provide the NCUA with prompt notification of any cyber incident that rises to the level of a reportable cyber incident. I'd like to reemphasize that the proposed rule would require such notification as soon as possible, but no later than 72 hours after a federally insured credit union reasonably believes that a reportable cyber incident has occurred. The proposed rule defines the cyber incident as an occurrence that actually or imminently jeopardizes, without lawful authority, the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of information on an information system, or actually or imminently jeopardizes, without lawful authority, an information system. In explaining when a cyber incident is reportable, I'm going to describe these as three distinct prongs. Also, for a cyber incident to be reportable, it does have to be a substantial incident that leads to one or more of the following. The first prong of reportable cyber incident definition would require a federally insured credit union to report a cyber incident that leads to a substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a network or member information system as a result of unauthorized access, or leads to the exposure of sensitive data, disruption of vital member services, or that has a serious impact on the safety and resiliency of operational systems and processes. For example, if a federally insured credit union becomes aware that a substantial level of sensitive data is unlawfully accessed, modified, or destroyed, or if the integrity of a network or member information system is compromised, the cyber incident is reportable. If the credit union becomes aware that a member information system has been unlawfully modified and/or sensitive data has been left exposed to an unauthorized person, process, or device, that cyber incident is also reportable, irrespective of intent. We understand that there are many technological reasons why services may not be available at any given time. For example, computer servers are offline or systems are being updated. Such events are routine and thus would not be reportable to the NCUA. Only a cyber incident that leads to a substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability would be reportable to the agency. The second prong of the reportable cyber incident definition would require reporting to the NCUA in the event of a cyber attack or exploitation of vulnerabilities that lead to a disruption of business operations, vital member services, or member information system. Cyber attacks that cause disruption to a federally insured credit union's business operations, vital member services, or member information system must be reported to NCUA within 72 hours of a federally insured credit union's reasonable belief that it has experienced a cyber attack. For example, a distributed denial of service attack that disrupts member account access would be reportable under this prong. However, blocked phishing attempts, failed attempts to gain access to systems, or unsuccessful malware attacks would not be reportable. The third prong of the reportable cyber incident definition would require a federally insured credit union to notify the agency either when a third-party service provider has informed a federally insured credit union the credit union's sensitive data or business operations have been compromised as a result of a cyber incident experienced by the third-party service provider, or upon the federally insured credit union forming a reasonable belief that this has occurred, whichever comes first. A compromise of a third-party system can be the result of an intentional cyber attack or unintentional disclosure, closure, or loss of information. Considering the high degree of reliance by federally insured credit unions upon third parties, it is imperative the NCUA be informed of any type of compromise to a third-party systems that places the credit union system at risk. Systemic risk from third-party vendors and credit union service organization is a significant concern, given that credit unions rely on many of the same third-party vendors. The proposed rule does exclude any event where the cyber incident is performed in good faith by an entity in response to a specific request by the owner or operator of the information system. An example of an incident excluded from reporting would be a credit union contracting a third party to conduct a penetration test. To reiterate, the proposed definition of cyber incident is intended to capture the reporting of substantial cyber incidents. What a federally insured credit union would consider to be substantial will likely depend on a variety of factors, including the size of the federally insured credit union, the type and impact of loss, and its duration, for example. The agency expects a federally insured credit union to exercise reasonable judgment in determining whether it has experienced a substantial cyber incident that would be reportable to the agency. Under this proposal, if a federally insured credit union is unsure as to whether a cyber incident is reportable, the NCUA encourages the federally insured credit union to contact the agency. Next, I will turn over the presentation to Ian to discuss the proposed basic reporting information, how the information will inform us, and our analysis on the burden and impact of this reporting to credit unions.
Thanks, Christina. This is Ian Morena. This reporting requirement is intended to serve as an early alert to the agency and is not intended to include a lengthy assessment of the incident. The agency will require only certain basic information to the extent it's known to the federally insured credit union at the time of reporting, such as the following: a basic description of the reportable cyber incident, including what functions were or are reasonably believed to have been affected, the estimated date range during which the reportable cyber incident took place, where applicable, a description of the exploited vulnerabilities and the techniques used to perpetrate the reportable cyber incident, any identifying or contact information of the actor or actors reasonably believed to be responsible, or the impact to the credit union's operations. As stated in the rule, the NCUA anticipates that further follow-up communications between the credit union and the agency would occur through the supervisory process as necessary. It's not expected that a credit union would typically be able to come to a reasonable belief that a reportable cyber incident has occurred immediately upon becoming aware of a cyber incident. Rather, it's anticipated that a credit union would take some time to understand the facts and circumstances of the incident in order to form a reasonable belief that it has experienced a reportable cyber incident. The proposed rule also recognizes that a credit union may not be able to form a reasonable belief that a reportable cyber incident has occurred outside of its normal business hours. Also, the rule notes that it's understood that these situations can be fluid that credit unions may be working expeditiously to resolve the reportable cyber incident at the time, and that additional information or changes to information may become available. For those reasons, the rule proposes 72 hours for notifying the NCUA of a reportable incident once the credit union has formed that reasonable belief that it has experienced a reportable cyber incident. As described in the rule, knowing about responding to cyber incidents affecting federally insured credit unions is important to the NCUA's mission for a variety of reasons, and I'll briefly highlight a few of those. First, the receipt of cyber incident information provides earlier awareness of emerging threats to individual credit unions, the credit union industry, and potentially to the broader financial system. Second, an incident may substantially harm or inconvenience a credit union's members and undermine its consumer protection obligations. In these cases, the sooner the NCUA knows of the event, the sooner it can take appropriate action, including helping the institution protect its members. Third, based on the NCUA's broad supervisory experience, it may be able to provide information and guidance to credit unions that may not have previously faced a particular type of cyber incident. This information would also better enable the NCUA to conduct analyses across the credit union system to improve guidance, adjust supervisory programs, and provide information to the industry to help credit unions protect themselves. Lastly, an incident may so severely impact a credit union that it can no longer support its members, and the incident could impact the safety and soundness of the credit union, leading to a failure. In these cases, the sooner the NCUA knows of the event, the better it can assess the extent of the threat and take appropriate action. This could include the NCUA facilitating requests from credit unions for assistance through the U.S. Treasury Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection. Early awareness of these cyber incidents will help the NCUA react to these threats before they become systemic. Now, the proposed rule does not include any prescribed reporting forms or templates, which is intended to minimize reporting burden to credit unions. The proposed rule also would require credit unions to notify the NCUA designated point of contact of the occurrence of a reportable cyber incident via email, telephone, or other similar methods that the NCUA may prescribe. While this notice requirement is more than currently required under the agency's regulations, the proposed rule is not expected to create a significant cost burden for federally insured credit unions, as the rule requires providing the agency with only limited information in the initial notice and not a full assessment or analysis of the incident. I'd also note the proposed rule contains a Paperwork Reduction Act section with additional information and requests for comments on these matters. And finally, if the board approves the proposed rule, it will be published in the near future in the Federal Register with a 60-day public comment period, and commenters can then submit their letters by the methods included in the proposed rule, which includes the regulations.gov website. Thank you, and this concludes our prepared remarks. We'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Over to you, Chairman Harper.
Thank you so much, Ian, and as well as to you, Yvonne and Christina, for your presentation on the proposed rule about cyber incident notification requirements for federally insured credit unions. I know that cybersecurity is not only a priority for me, but it is also a priority for my fellow board members. This proposed rule is important because of a rapidly evolving set of cybersecurity events and the urgent need to maintain a heightened state of awareness and vigilance across the credit union, as well as the broader financial services systems. Considering the ongoing geopolitical upheaval caused by Russia's war on Ukraine, our increasingly interconnected world, and the countless fraudsters and scammers who lurk in the ether, the NCUA and all credit unions must stay ahead of bad actors who perpetrate cyber attacks. As cyber attacks grow in sophistication and scope, we, in other words, need all hands on deck to protect the credit union system. Therefore, the NCUA board's approval for issuing the proposed rule before us today is a critical step to increasing cybersecurity awareness and protection within the financial system. Federally insured credit unions are not only the system's first line of defense, but they are also the NCUA's eyes and ears. To that end, the proposed rule would set parameters for what constitutes a reportable incident and the minimum notification requirements. By doing so, the proposal would align with the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, signed into law in March. The proposed rule would also bring the NCUA's cyber incident reporting framework into greater alignment with those of federal banking regulators. Last November, our sister agencies finalized their computer security incident reporting rule. That rule requires a banking organization to notify its primary federal regulator of any significant computer security incident no later than 36 hours after the banking organization determines a reportable cybersecurity incident occurred. We expect credit unions to exercise their best judgment in determining whether a substantial cyber incident is reportable to the NCUA. Also, the board anticipates a credit union would need sufficient time, as Ian outlined, to form a reasonable belief that it has experienced a reportable incident. Under this proposal, the 72-hour clock starts only once the credit union has formed a reasonable belief that it has experienced a reportable cyber incident. Given the frequency and severity of cyber incidents within the financial services industry, the board would encourage credit unions to contact the agency if they are uncertain about whether a cyber incident is reportable. And this point bears underscoring. The proposed rule emphasizes the earliest possible initial report of an incident instead of a comprehensive forensic analysis, which will take much longer to report. As more incidents are reported, a reservoir of knowledge, experience, and best practices will be developed, from which every credit union stands to benefit. This information has potentially wide-ranging impact beyond the credit union system. For example, additional data points on cyber incidents can help law enforcement and intelligence agencies provide advanced warning to other organizations within our nation's critical infrastructure sector. When credit unions report these types of incidents, they may keep our nation secure from similar cyber attacks elsewhere. With that, I do have a few questions. And Yvonne, let's start with you. One difference between the proposed rule before us today and the other federal banking regulators reporting requirement is that the time frame is different for the two. Could you explain why our time frame is 72 hours and how that differs from the 36 hours that the federal banking regulators have required?
This is Yvonne. We recognize that a federally insured credit union may be working expeditiously to resolve the reportable cyber incident at the time it would be expected to notify the agency. Thus, we believe 72 hours is a reasonable amount of time to notify the agency upon making that determination that a cyber incident, reportable cyber incident has occurred. In addition, the proposed rule mirrors the 72-hour reporting requirement in the Cyber Incident Reporting of the Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. So therefore, minimizing the burden of federal credit unions having several different reporting requirements. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Yvonne. In terms of reportable incidents, can you explain if something as simple as a phishing email, which credit unions receive hundreds upon thousands and in some instances each day, would be an example of a reportable incident? In other words, what do we really mean by a substantial cyber incident?
This is Yvonne. An unsuccessful phishing email would not be reportable under this rule. The proposed definition of a reportable cyber incident is intended to capture the reporting of substantial cyber incidents. What a federal insured credit union would consider to be substantial will likely depend on a variety of factors, including the size of that credit union, the type and impact of the loss, and the duration of the incident, for example. The agency expects a federally insured credit union to exercise reasonable judgment in determining whether it has experienced a substantial cyber incident that would be reportable to the agency. Under this proposal, we have also asked for comments to determine if we should include a definition of substantial in the final rule. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you, and I look forward to those comments. One more question. Could a cyber intrusion, which does not at the time of discovery include the loss of member shares or render an information technology system inoperable, be reportable? And if so, why would that happen?
This is Yvonne again. I'll take that question. A cyber intrusion that did not at the time of discovery include the loss of member shares or render an information system inoperable may be reporting. The agency would expect that a federally insured credit union exercise reasonable judgment in determining whether the cyber intrusion led to a substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of network or member information systems that results from the unauthorized access to or exposure of the sensitive data, disrupts vital member services, or has serious impact on the safety and resilience of an operational system and processes. And of course, under this proposal, if a credit union is unsure as to whether a cyber incident is reportable, we encourage the credit union to contact the agency. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you. I appreciate that context on understanding what is reportable, what isn't reportable, and when you're in that gray area, what you should be doing. With respect to burdens imposed by this proposed rule, how have we sought to minimize any costs associated with compliance?
Hi, this is Christina. I can take that question.
Sure.
To minimize the burden and cost, the proposed rule is only requiring notification of a reportable cyber incident. The proposed rule is not requiring credit unions to provide any type of detailed incident assessment to the NCUA within that 72-hour time frame. However, we have also requested comments on the best methods for reporting these incidents to the NCUA. This concludes my response.
Thank you so much, Christina. My final question, some have raised questions about the cybersecurity reporting requirements that apply to the NCUA. Would you please explain some of the reporting requirements that the agency is subject to and who sets those reporting requirements? Why must the NCUA adhere to those cyber reporting standards?
This is Yvonne. I'll take that question. The NCUA is subject to several cyber incident and breach reporting standards set by Congress and the administration. The NCUA must report information security incidents where the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a federal information system is potentially compromised to the CISA US CERT organization within 1 hour of being identified. If the incident meets the definition of a major incident, the NCUA must report the incident to CISA and the Office of Management and Budget, Office of the Federal Information Chief Information Officer as well. The NCUA must also notify the appropriate congressional committees and the NCUA Office of the Inspector General of a major incident no later than 7 days after the date on which the agency determined that it has a reasonable basis to conclude that a major incident has occurred. Similar to how credit unions notify the NCUA of a cyber incident could assist, my apologies. Similar to how credit unions notify the agency of a cyber incident could assist in better understanding potential risk to the industry, the NCUA's notification requirements may also assist in reducing demonstrable harm to the national security interests, foreign relations, or the economy of the United States, or to the public confidence, civil liberties, or the public health and safety of the American people. That concludes my response.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I appreciate those observations. Vice Chairman Hoffman, I recognize you now.
Thank you, sir. And I also want to thank Yvonne team for this presentation. The weight of regulatory compliance continues to grow. Large and small credit unions bear this burden, with the consequences affecting staffing, services, and the support for their members. Regulatory burden is an issue often cited during mergers, especially with smaller credit unions. But there's no doubt cybersecurity is critically important, but we must be realistic about what is necessary. We don't want a situation where a bad actor causes even more damage via a permanent regulatory burden. One somewhat imperfect example is that millions of Americans take their shoes off in airports every day because 21 years ago, one guy happened to use his shoes to take on board what could have and still can be easily delivered a number of other ways. No other country in the world requires taking shoes off at airports. And we Americans, we get made fun of in foreign countries because we take our shoes off even though it's not required. You can do the math on what that costs in time and energy. Not to mention, travelers say the shoes off policy is one of the most disliked aspects of American airports, thus pushing more folks to drive, a method of transportation that causes far more fatalities than flying does. All of this is to say that we don't want a cyber incident to result in permanent regulatory changes that wind up causing more damage than necessary. Compliance is always easier for the people that don't have to do it. Credit unions should spend time and money on cybersecurity, not waste time and money on cybersecurity. I appreciate that you and the team approach this proposed rule with that in mind. This proposed rule is about reporting to NCUA only, although additional reporting may be required by CISA once they promulgate their rules. It's important to note that NCUA does not publicize the name of credit unions that report cyber incidents. Requirements on notifying credit union members and the public are not changing nor being considered. In this proposed rule, we're asking for comment on what should not be considered a reportable incident. As it is proposed, the definition follows the cyber incident reporting for the Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. That was part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. Credit unions are being asked to report as soon as possible and not later than 72 hours after the credit union reasonably believes an incident has occurred. This time frame of 72 hours is what CISA will require in 2025. I should add that NCUA itself faces similar requirements. This is something I asked about since it's so important that government understand what it's like to live under the same rules. NCUA is required to report information, security incidents, to CISA within 1 hour, I believe, of being identified by the agency's top computer security incident response team. Credit unions are not required to provide a detailed incident assessment to the NCUA within a 72-hour time frame. We realize that can be difficult. This is the initial notification once they reasonably believe an incident has occurred. The earlier NCUA is notified, the faster the agency can assess whether the incident is isolated or widespread. This should benefit credit unions because NCUA can alert credit unions about the type of recent cyber incidents, again, without mentioning the name of the credit union that reported it. No timelines for providing a detailed incident assessment are being considered or changed by this proposed rule. This proposed rule contemplates a single point of contact at NCUA for reporting incidents, although there's a question in the NPR asking for input on this issue. The need for robust cybersecurity is the new normal, and this proposed rule is asking for input on a number of requirements. We take your comments seriously. I urge stakeholders to help us make this rule as effective as possible without asking credit unions to take off their shoes all the time. I have a couple questions. Here's the first one, which is just to review, how much leeway does NCUA have with regard to what is considered a reportable incident?
And this is Ian Morena. I think that Yvonne may be having some technical difficulty, so I could try to take Mr. Vice Chairman. So the NCUA does have leeway to determine what's considered a reportable incident. However, as the remarks addressed, it was decided it was best to closely follow the recent legislation, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022, given that once CISA promulgates its rules in a few years, the NCUA reporting requirement may also potentially meet CISA requirements. And as you mentioned in your remarks, the agency, similar to credit unions, is required to report cyber incidents meeting certain requirements, as you noted. That concludes my response.
Thank you, sir. So walk me through this. What happens when the agency is notified of a cyber incident, right? I'm assuming it's a phone call or an email. NCUA reads the email or hangs up the phone. What happens next?
Sure. This is Christina Sari. I can take that question. So when a credit union reports a cyber incident, several things will occur. First, we're going to evaluate the severity of the incident to determine whether it's isolated to the individual credit union, what the potential impact to the credit union members. We also have to consider whether the incident may pose an emerging threat to other credit unions, the credit union industry as a whole, or even the broader financial system. Incidents that have potential to impact other credit unions in the credit union industry may result in the issuance of cyber alerts to highlight the threat to credit unions and ensure that they've taken the appropriate steps to harden their cybersecurity infrastructure. Incidents that impact the broader financial industry will be shared with CISA and other regulatory agencies as appropriate. Secondly, any incidents reported to the NCUA will be shared with appropriate regional examination staff so that they can ensure the credit union was able to adequately recover from the incident and resume any services that might be impacted. And of course, if assistance is needed, we do have resources available to aid them. This concludes my response.
Thank you for that. So vague regulation is bad regulation. we all want it to be as clear as possible, and credit unions should and should not report to NCUA. It benefits all parties. I understand that there's 3 broad situations that contribute to cyber incident. Do you mind reviewing again what these 3 situations are and where these 3 came from?
Sure, this is Christina Sari again. So you are correct. There are 3 broad situations that can trigger the reporting of a cyber incident. And these provisions are based on the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. So the first provision requires a federally insured credit union to report a cyber incident that leads to the substantial loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a member information system as a result of the exposure of sensitive data, disruption of vital member services, or has a serious impact on the safety and resiliency of operational systems and processes. So an example of that is, a credit union can become aware that a member information system has been unlawfully modified or sensitive data has been left exposed to unauthorized persons. That cyber incident is reportable under that first provision. The second provision would require reporting to the NCUA in the event of a cyber attack that leads to a disruption of business operations, vital member services, or member information system. So once again, for example, a denial of service attack that does disrupt member account access would be reportable under this provision. Once again, blocked phishing attempts, failed attempts, or unsuccessful malware attacks would not be reportable. The third provision would require a federally insured credit union to notify their agency when they are notified that a third-party service provider has been compromised as a result of a cyber incident. And if that affects the credit union, we do expect that to be reported under this prong as well. So this concludes my response.
Gotcha. Detailed response, and you guys have obviously put a lot of thought into this. If this rule becomes policy, I'd like to recommend NCUA publish a clear side-by-side list of examples that definitely are and are not reportable incidents. Ideally, this would be emailed directly to credit unions, not just published on our website. And I know that we're not going to cover every scenario, but if I was the credit union employee who is responsible for adhering to this new policy, I'd appreciate a useful cheat sheet that says these incidents are definitely reportable, these are not, and if in doubt, here's the contact at NCUA. It's the sort of image I would save to my phone, so it's always there. Does that sort of cheat sheet sound useful and doable if this becomes policy?
We do currently have a few examples in the rule, but those definitely, can be expanded on. I believe that there could be definitely use in having a quick cheat sheet, as long as there's the understanding that obviously that is not the whole universe of things that could happen.
Yeah, I think we recognize some of these things happen with someone woken up in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and they don't want to be fumbling for some email or going to ncua.gov to see. And in the scenario where there's a cyber incident, one may not be able to access online material, especially if you're at your office that was hacked. So I'd want to just pull up my phone, I don't know, I'm picturing like an image or two saying yes, no, if in doubt, contact right here. So I appreciate your willingness to work on that. And I'll conclude with this. By the way, regarding my comments about the Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and the shoes off policy at U.S. airports, in my public remarks that are posted to our website, there's a hyperlink to a recent column about this that does a pretty good job of going through it. The purpose of the column was to encourage the White House to consider repealing that policy. I just found it interesting. That concludes my remarks. Back to Chairman Harper.
Thank you so much. I appreciate those comments and observations, and certainly a cheat sheet should not only be available directly to the credit unions, but we could put it in our Cybersecurity Resource Center, which I know credit unions often turn to and use. Board Member Hood, you are now recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank Yvonne and Christina and Ian for today's presentation. You all coming again from having met with global and worldwide regulators at the World Council event. You all can imagine that the one issue when I'm talking to regulators from all parts of the world that's that cybersecurity is that one issue that keeps us all up at night. And it's also one of the top concerns I hear when talking with credit unions here domestically as well. And it's something I want you to know that this NCUA board is really committed to helping give you all the guidance you need to really have strong cybersecurity postures. And I'm so glad that we have a wonderful dedicated team here at the agency that's looking to help us address these issues. I wish we could all say, though, that after having focused on this threat for such a long time, we're making progress toward a real sustainable solution. But unfortunately, that's simply not the case given the velocity and evolution of cybersecurity threats. As such, we have to accept that cybersecurity threats are an ongoing risk, both to financial institutions' operations and to their reputations. Moreover, we have to accept that the risk is a moving target. Today's rule before the board reflects this present reality. Every credit union must recognize that their institution is just one wrong email or malicious link away from being on the front pages. Given those realities, even those of us who favor a more balanced approach to regulatory matters, we must recognize that the agency's cybersecurity review and supervision capabilities will necessarily have to be more robust in the days ahead. Today's rule is a step forward in that endeavor. Gone are the days, you all, when you have a vendor provide you with an add-on patch to address a vulnerability and simply move on. Today, we need to be thinking defense in depth when it comes to cybersecurity. That means not only addressing vulnerabilities and recognizing threats, but also having response plans in place that not only identify vulnerabilities, but also catch attacks in real time and proactively prevent their impact on a credit union. I support today's proposed rule and look forward to receiving comments soon. I have no questions or comments at this time other than just thanking you all for your hard work and to know that this is an issue that's going to remain ongoing vigilance. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Hood. I really appreciated your framing there. It's very helpful. Is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the board approve proposed rule part 748 of NCUA's rules and regulations for a 60-day comment period as attached to the board action memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
Yes, I second the motion.
There is a sufficient second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show that the motion passed 3-0. Thank you, everyone. That is the end of our agenda today. As is the board's standard practice, we will not meet in August, and I hope that everyone takes some time next month to refresh and recharge. We certainly all need it. But I also know that all of us are looking forward to returning to in-person meetings in September. There being no further business, we are hereby adjourned.